It was almost midnight when he pulled up the security feed on his phone. The office was supposed to be empty. It wasn't. There she was, Renée, a black woman who had given 2 years of her life to a man who ran an empire from behind a glass tower, a man whose name made grown men lower their eyes. Standing alone in the dark, holding his coat. Not moving it, not folding it. Holding it, with both arms, her face buried in the fabric. Her shoulders shaking with the kind of crying that only happens when a person believes, completely, that no one is watching. He was watching. Jeon Hyun-Woo, Korean Mafia boss, CEO of a $340 million empire, a man who had never once lost control of a room, sat frozen in his car in the underground parking garage, staring at a 4-inch screen, unable to look away. She wasn't crying over the coat. She was crying over him. Over 2 years of loving a man who came to her with all his secrets, all his complaints about a cold and calculating wife, and still went home to that same wife every single night. She had never asked for anything, until 3 days before this moment, when she finally did. And what he decided to do next, what his wife had already set in motion, and what one unexpected phone call from the most unlikely person would reveal before it was all over, changed everything. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a member and help our channel. There is a particular kind of power that only exists in silence. Not the silence of empty rooms, or the silence that follows a threat, but the silence of a man who has trained himself over decades to reveal absolutely nothing. The silence of someone who learned, very early, that information is the only currency that never loses value, and that the most dangerous thing a person can do is let someone else know what they feel before they have decided what to do about it. Jeon Hyun-Woo had built his entire life inside that silence. He had built an empire there. He had built walls there. Clean, precise, invisible walls that no rival had ever found a way through, that no government investigator had ever located the edge of, that 14 years of marriage had never once breached in any direction that mattered. He sat at the top of a glass tower in the middle of Los Angeles, and every camera in that building fed directly to a screen he could pull up from anywhere, from the back of his car, from a restaurant booth, from the private elevator that no one else had a code for. He saw everything. He knew everything. That was the architecture of his safety, and it had never failed him. Until the night it showed him something he did not know how to file away. It was 23:47 when the feed from the 14th floor populated on his phone screen. He had been sitting in the underground parking structure for 11 minutes, engine off, telling himself he had come back for documents. The building was supposed to be empty. His people cleared out by 10. The cameras were there as a formality at that hour. A habit, not a necessity. And then, there she was. Renée Caldwell, standing alone in the dark of his office, lit only by the cold blue glow of the monitors, holding his coat. Not carrying it. Not moving it from one place to another. Holding it. With both arms, her face buried in the fabric of it, her shoulders pulled inward and shaking with the particular, private violence of someone who has been holding something in for a very long time, and has finally, in the only moment they believe themselves to be unobserved, allowed it to come out. He watched her for 4 minutes and 32 seconds. He knew the precise count because he was a man who counted things, who measured, who assessed, whose entire survival had been built on the ability to observe a situation and determine within moments exactly what it cost and exactly what it was worth. He could not determine this. He had known Renée for 2 years. He had hired her because she was intelligent, contained, and dangerous in the specific way that useful people are. She saw things quickly and said only what needed to be said. In the first month, she had reorganized the external-facing logistics of 3 of his companies without being asked. In the second month, she had quietly corrected an error in his scheduling that would have placed him in 2 locations simultaneously on a day he could not afford witnesses. She had not mentioned it. She had simply fixed it. He had noticed, and he had not mentioned that he noticed, and they had understood each other from that point forward in the way that 2 precise people sometimes do. Without words, without ceremony, without anything so imprecise as explanation. What had happened after that was not something he had planned. He was not a man who made unplanned movements. And yet, 6 months of late evenings, coffee that appeared without request, silences that held a different quality than the silences of his professional life. Not the silence of strategy, but something closer to the silence of 2 people who have stopped needing to perform for each other. And then one night, not dramatically, not with the weight of a decision, it simply happened. The way a structural failure happens. Not in the moment the wall comes down, but in the 100 quiet moments before, when no one thought to check the foundation. He had told himself it was controlled. He had told himself many things. And now he was sitting in a dark car watching a woman hold his coat like it was the only thing keeping her upright. And every system he had for processing information was returning the same result. He understood exactly what he was seeing. He just did not yet know what he was going to do about it. He put the car in drive and went upstairs. The elevator opened without a sound. She heard it anyway. He watched her move, the speed of it, the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 2 years learning to be unreadable in front of him. And he recognized it because it was the same mechanism he used himself. The coat was back on the hook before he had taken 3 steps into the room. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted by a fraction. By the time she turned, she had assembled something close to composure, and if he had been anyone else, it might have worked. But he had been watching her face on a 4-inch screen for 4 minutes and 32 seconds, and he knew what it looked like before she rebuilt it. They stood in the blue-gray dark of the office and said nothing for a moment that stretched in a way that moments rarely did for either of them. Both of them accustomed to controlling the temperature of a room, and neither of them, in this particular room, able to. She told him she had forgotten her phone. Her voice was steady, almost convincing. He said her name. She stopped, kept her back to him for 1 breath, 2, and then asked how long he had been there, in the tone of someone who already knew the answer and was simply deciding how much of the truth they were willing to stand inside. He told her. Enough. What came after that was not a fight. It did not have the shape of a fight. No volume, no acceleration, none of the sharp edges that conflict usually carried in his world. It was something quieter and therefore more difficult to navigate. She told him she knew how the story ended. She had always known. She told him that 2 years of listening to a man describe his unhappiness was not the same as that man choosing to do anything. Los Angeles spread out below him the way it always did. Indifferent, luminous, vast in a way that had nothing to do with any individual decision being made inside any individual building. He had stood at this window during negotiations that could have ended careers, during phone calls that rerouted millions of dollars, during moments that the people on the other side of them would remember for the rest of their lives. He had always known what to say at windows. He told her about Jeon coming to the office. The stillness that moved through Renée's body when he said it was the kind that precedes something. Not panic, not anger, but the specific interior rearrangement of a person who has just had a suspicion confirmed that they had been hoping, quietly and without admitting it, would turn out to be wrong. Jeon had used the key she still had. She had come when Renée was one floor down, in a meeting that he had arranged and that he now understood, in retrospect, had run slightly longer than necessary. She had gone through the desk. She had found nothing. Renée was too careful for that, had always been too careful. But she had asked about her, had used the word she used for things she was certain of but could not yet prove. She had said that Renée looked at him in a way she recognized. He told Renée this plainly, the way he delivered all information that mattered, without softening it, without framing it, because in his experience the frame was where people hid the parts they were afraid to say out loud. She asked what he had told Jeon. He told her what he had said. Professional, efficient, and watched those words land on her the way he had known they would when he chose them in that moment with Jeon standing in this same office. Because he had known even then that he would eventually have to say them to Renée's face, and that they would not sound the way he intended them to. She took his coat from the hook. She held it out to him. Her arms were steady. Her eyes were not. He looked at the coat. He looked at her. He asked her why she had been crying. And something in her face shifted. The last layer of the thing she had built in the 2 minutes since the elevator opened, coming apart not dramatically, but the way careful things come apart when the person holding them together simply runs out of the particular energy that holding requires. She told him she was an idiot. She told him she had made the mistake of feeling something that was never part of any agreement between them, and that she had compounded that mistake by believing, for longer than she should have, that his unhappiness was a door, rather than simply a room he had learned to live in. He took the coat from her hands, slowly. He did not step back. And then he said the only true thing he had said out loud in longer than he could accurately calculate, that she was the only place where he told the truth. The phone on his desk began to vibrate. Neither of them moved toward it. It vibrated again. And somewhere across the city, in a house full of expensive things and no warmth whatsoever, a woman sat with a glass of wine and a phone and a folder of photographs, smiling at nothing, already 3 steps ahead of a conversation that had not yet happened, in a game that she believed, with complete confidence, only she knew they were playing. Jeon had never been a woman who acted from emotion. That was the thing people misunderstood about her, the people who watched her break things, who flinched at her voice when it climbed, who described her to others using words like volatile and unpredictable and difficult. They saw the surface of it and drew the wrong conclusion. Every plate she had ever broken had been broken deliberately. Every accusation she had ever thrown had been thrown with precision. The performance of jealousy was not jealousy. It was information gathering. It was pressure applied to specific points to observe what moved, what held, and what cracked. She had learned this from her father. Park Sun-jin had built his organization on the principle that the most powerful position in any room was the one where you already knew every outcome before the conversation began. He had taught her this the way he taught her everything. Not directly, not with words, but by example. By watching him operate across 3 decades of decisions that other people only understood in retrospect. She had absorbed it. She had simply applied it to a different theater. The investigator she had hired 4 weeks ago was not the first one. He was the third. The first 2 had given her what she already knew: proximity, pattern, the specific texture of a professional relationship that had stopped being purely professional. The third had given her documentation. Not enough for a courtroom, more than enough for a family council. She finished her wine, poured another, did not drink it immediately. The photographs were good, not incriminating in any explicit sense. She had not needed explicit. She had needed evidence of sustained proximity after hours, of a particular quality of physical ease between two people who were supposed to be employer and employee, of the small, unconscious adjustments that bodies make around people they have stopped pretending in front of. The investigator had understood the assignment. What she had not planned for, what she was only now, sitting in the quiet of a house that had stopped feeling like a home sometime in the previous decade, beginning to consider, was that Hyun-Woo might have already moved. She knew him. She had known him for 14 years, which was long enough to understand that his silences had different qualities. The silence of the past 3 weeks had been the kind that preceded action, rather than the kind that preceded endurance. She had felt it, and accelerated her own timeline accordingly. What she had not fully calculated was whether she was accelerating into something he had already set in motion, or whether she was still ahead of it. She picked up her phone. He answered on the second ring. His voice was exactly what it always was, level, unreadable, the voice of a man returning a call he had been expecting. She said what she had prepared to say. The photographs, her father, Friday. She kept her own voice sweet, which was the register she used when she wanted him to understand that she was entirely serious. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked where she wanted to meet. She told him. The house. Lunch. Tomorrow. She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand and tried to locate, somewhere in his 2-word agreement to come, any indication of his internal temperature. She found nothing. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that the nothing felt different than it normally did. Not the nothing of a man suppressing a reaction, but the nothing of a man who had already finished having one. She almost called her father that night. She decided to wait. Across the city, in the office on the 14th floor, Renée was putting on her coat. Her own coat, the one she had retrieved from the back of her chair, and Hyun-Woo was standing near the window again, not looking at Los Angeles this time, but at the folder his attorney had sent to his private server 3 weeks ago, and which he had not opened in front of anyone until this morning. He had not planned to open it tonight either, but something about the phone call had clarified something for him in the way that external pressure sometimes does. Not by changing what he wanted, but by removing the last ambient uncertainty about whether he was willing to accept the cost of it. He looked at Renée. She was watching him with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to say something. The slight stillness around her eyes, the way her chin leveled. She said it. She told him that she had meant what she said, that she did not want to be the reason, that if he was going to do whatever he was considering doing, she needed it to be because it was true for him, independent of her, or she could not be any part of what came after. He looked at her for a long moment. He told her it was already true, independent of her. He told her she had simply been honest enough to make him stop pretending otherwise. She nodded once, slowly, the way she absorbed information she had needed to hear and was now integrating with the carefulness it deserved. Then she picked up her clutch, this small black one with the gold clasp that caught the light from the monitors, and she walked toward the elevator. And she stopped at the door. She did not turn around. She told him to lock up. He watched the elevator doors close behind her. Then he sat down at his desk, opened the folder, and began to read the documents he already knew by heart. Not because he needed to, but because some decisions deserve to be made twice. Once in the body, where they have already been made for longer than the mind has been willing to admit, and once on paper, where they become real in the particular way that only written things are real, permanent, irrevocable, and finally, after everything, honest. His phone screen lit up one more time that night. It was not Jeon. It was a number he had not seen in 4 months. A number that belonged to a man he had not expected to hear from before Friday, and whose name appearing on that screen at this particular hour meant that the situation had already moved beyond the shape he had assumed it would take. He picked up. He listened. And for the first time in a very long time, Jeon Hyun-Woo did not already know what was going to happen next. Park Sung-jin arrived at the restaurant before anyone else. This was a habit so old it had become reflex. The man who arrives first controls the room before the room begins. He had chosen the location himself, a private dining room in the back of a Korean restaurant in Koreatown that had been operating under one of his holding companies for 11 years, where the staff understood that certain tables did not exist and certain conversations had never taken place. He sat with his hands folded on the white tablecloth and waited, and when Hyun-Woo walked through the door at exactly the agreed time, Park Sung-jin watched him cross the room with the particular attention of a man who has been watching another man for a very long time and has learned to read what the body says when the face has been trained to say nothing. He saw it immediately. Not guilt, not defiance. Something quieter and therefore more significant. The particular stillness of a person who has made a decision and is no longer expending energy on the question of whether to make it. He gestured to the chair across from him. Hyun-Woo sat. Neither of them spoke for a moment, in the way that men who have known each other across decades of high-stakes silence sometimes do not speak. Not from discomfort, but from a mutual understanding that the first sentence would set the temperature for everything that followed, and that both of them were precise enough to want to place it correctly. Park Sung-jin reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He placed an envelope on the table between them. He told Hyun-Woo to open it. The documents inside were clean, properly filed, bearing the signature that Hyun-Woo had been preparing to pursue through channels that would have taken weeks and cost considerably more than paper. He looked at them. He looked at the old man across the table. He asked the question that the situation required. How? And why? And why now? Park Sung-jin was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was without the cadences of business or negotiation, without the careful architecture of a man managing an outcome. It was something closer to plain speech, which was, Hyun-Woo understood, the most expensive thing a man in his position could offer. He told him about the cameras. Not Hyun-Woo's cameras, his own. Installed years ago in the 14th-floor office not as surveillance of Hyun-Woo specifically, but as the standard precaution of a patriarch who had never fully separated professional oversight from paternal habit. He had not been monitoring actively. He had been reviewing archived footage 2 nights ago for an unrelated reason, when the timestamp from the previous evening had populated on his screen, and he had watched. The way Hyun-Woo had watched, without intending to, without being able to stop. A woman alone in a dark office, holding a coat that did not belong to her, coming apart in the specific and private way of someone who believes themselves completely unobserved. Park Sung-jin told him that he had sat with that footage for a long time. He told him that he had a daughter who had never once, in 39 years, looked at anything the way that woman looked at that coat. He told him that he had spent a long time believing that the alliance between their families was the architecture upon which everything else was built, and that this was true, and that it would remain true, because the alliance was between organizations and not between individuals, and that he had been wrong, and he used that word without qualification to allow the political structure of it to consume the personal lives of the people inside it for as long as he had. Hyun-Woo listened without moving. The old man told him that Jeon had signed under her own understanding that this conclusion was inevitable, that she was her father's daughter, and her father's daughter understood inevitability when she was finally shown it clearly enough. He told him that the conversation with Jeon had not been without difficulty, and he did not elaborate on that, and Hyun-Woo did not ask, because some rooms are entered alone. He told him the alliance would continue, on new terms, terms that Hyun-Woo would propose, because the organization Hyun-Woo had built on the foundation the Parks had provided had long since exceeded anything the foundation alone could have produced, and Park Sung-jin was old enough and honest enough to say so out loud. Hyun-Woo looked at the envelope on the table for a long time. Then he looked at the man across from him, 71 years old, hands that had directed decades of decisions that no public record would ever contain, eyes that were tired in the way that only very long and very heavy lives produce. And he understood that what was happening in this room was not a negotiation, and was not a concession, and was not a transaction. It was an accounting. A man looking at the ledger of his choices and paying, quietly, the one debt that had been accumulating longest. He took the envelope. That afternoon, he returned to the 14th floor. The office was exactly as it always was. The light through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city below, the monitors on the wall showing their quiet feeds from every angle of a building that had witnessed more truth in the past 48 hours than in the 2 years before them combined. Renée was at her desk, posture perfect, hair catching the light, the small gold moon at her throat moving slightly as she breathed. She looked up when he came in, and in the half-second before she assembled her expression into something neutral, he saw what he had seen on the monitor 2 nights ago. Unguarded, unperformed, entirely real. He crossed the room. He placed the envelope on her desk without explanation. She opened it slowly, the way she did everything that mattered, with full attention, without rushing, giving the thing in front of her the seriousness it deserved. She read it once. She read it again. When she raised her eyes back to his, they were bright in a way she did not try to conceal, and he found that he did not want her to. She told him he was a very complicated man. He told her he knew. She told him he was dangerous. He told her that too. She told him she should probably say no. He told her, probably. She looked at him for a long moment that contained, somehow, the full weight of 2 years of careful distance and late evenings and silences that had meant more than either of them had been willing to name. Then she set the envelope down on the desk with the particular deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is placing it somewhere real, somewhere it can be returned to, somewhere it cannot be taken back from. She told him she could not be his secretary anymore. He raised an eyebrow. She told him that if this was going to be something real, then it had to be separate from everything that had allowed it to stay hidden, that she refused to be convenient, refused to be contained, refused to be the thing that fit neatly into the architecture of a life that was already being dismantled and rebuilt. She told him she wanted her own door, her own title, her own terms. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, in the office where he had spent years being unreadable, under cameras that had already taken more from him than any rival ever had, Jeon Hyun-Woo smiled. Not the controlled, functional expression he deployed in rooms where smiling was strategically useful. Something older than that. Something that had been waiting behind 14 years of calculation for someone precise enough and brave enough and foolish enough to reach past all of it and find it there. He told her he would hire someone else. She nodded once. And outside, 40 floors below, Los Angeles continued in every direction, indifferent and luminous and vast, entirely unaware that somewhere in a glass tower above it, two people who had spent 2 years pretending not to know exactly what they were to each other had finally, in the quiet that follows a long and necessary reckoning, stopped pretending. The coat hung on the hook by the door. Neither of them looked at it. They didn't need to anymore. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever given someone the most honest, unguarded version of yourself? Been the person they ran to with every truth they couldn't tell anyone else, only to wonder if any of it actually meant something to them? Or if you were simply convenient? And have you ever been so afraid of what choosing love would cost you that you built an entire architecture of excuses around that fear and called it strategy? Sometimes the cameras we think are protecting us are the very things that finally force us to see what we've been refusing to look at. Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about honesty, courage, and the kind of love that refuses to stay hidden forever, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.